Okay, so I think we can just get started there. So, hi everyone, and thank you for coming. Welcome to our webinar series on language and sustainable development. For those joining us for the first time, I'm Colin Riley, and this series is being organised by the Bringing the Outside In research project. So this is a collaborative project between the universities of Essex, Dar es Salaam, Botswana and Zambia, and involves quite a large team. So myself, Nancy Kula, Tracy Costley and Hannah Gibson, and Joseph Mwansa, Mompoloki Bagwasi and Gaston Mapunda. So our research is on multilingual learning and achievement in the context of Botswana, Tanzania and Zambia. And the clue to what our project is about is in our short title, Bringing the Outside In. So we are aiming to understand what roles the multiple languages that learners use outside of the classroom can or should have in influencing learning within the classroom, as often, usually, there's only one medium of instruction. And we're funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund through the British Academy. So we thought that it would be quite nice to bring together similar projects and similar work that has a focus on language and sustainable development, to see what research is going on, what impacting results are emerging, and to see whether there are any synergies that we can draw on. And also, just as an opportunity to discuss some of the more practical aspects of conducting South-North research. So this is the fifth and final talk in our series, and we're very grateful to all of our speakers for kindly agreeing to take part and for presenting their work, and also especially to all of you for joining us and for your contributions and questions. So recordings of all our talks so far can be found on our project website. Just as a practical point, so questions for this session will just be done through the chat box. So as the talk is going on, if you have any questions, just put them there, and then we'll have time at the end for a question and answer session. The talk will be roughly 30 minutes long, and we'll have about 20 minutes for questions at the end, and we'll aim to finish up at 1 o'clock. So today we are delighted to welcome Professor Leon Tickley. Leon is the UNESCO Chair in Inclusive Good Quality Education and Global Chair in Education at the University of Bristol. He also co-directs the Centre for International and Comparative Education in the School of Education, and he is the Principal Investigator on the Global Challenges Research Fund Network Plus, Transforming Education for Sustainable Futures. So please welcome Professor Leon Tickley for his talk on conceptualizing language supported learning for cross-curriculum engagement in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Great, okay, thanks very much. Colin, can I just check, can you see the PowerPoint there? You can, okay, great, all right. So first of all, thanks for the invitation, and it's a great honor and privilege to be presenting in this important seminar series. Language, of course, is central to sustainable development. And in the context of education for sustainable development, it's particularly important because, of course, it's a way of accessing different kinds of knowledge, both inside and outside of the classroom, which is critical for bringing in, for example, indigenous perspectives into the classroom. So it's a very important topic. Just to say before I start the presentation a little bit about our Network Plus, which is looking at education for sustainable development in Somalia, Rwanda, South Africa and India. And we will be issuing a call for proposals in December. So do keep your eyes open for that. We have a website, and I'll be happy to share the link a bit later on in the chat. But we will welcome proposals that look at the issue of language because it is so important for sustainable development. The presentation I'm going to be presenting on today, or the research I'm going to be presenting on today, was conducted actually 4 or 5 years ago now. So, but we've been doing some more work subsequently in Rwanda, and we feel that the topic is still highly relevant. I'd like to talk a little bit about the difficulties in getting the findings of the project taken up by the government at the end, because I think those have implications, I think, for other language projects, GCRF and other language projects. So basically, this was a DFID-funded project. It looked at the role of language-supported textbooks and pedagogy in learning in Rwanda. And it was conducted by a team of us that included John Clegg and Lizzie Milligan, as well as colleagues at the University of Rwanda, and was also conducted in collaboration with the British Council, which was very significant because that gave us some traction with policy, but also, of course, with the British Council that play a very important role in promoting language bilingual or language policy in support of disadvantaged learners on the African continent. So the immediate issue that we sought to address through the project was that primary year 4 learners in Rwanda can't read their English medium textbooks. So Rwanda, like many other sub-Saharan African countries, expects learners to transit from at a relatively early age, around eight years old, from the mother tongue to a global language, in this case English. And of course, I think those of you who are familiar with the Rwandan context know that it's been a highly contested issue there. That they had quite a sudden, rapid change from French as the global language to English about 10 years ago now, which was very sudden. And the teachers had literally weeks with very minimal training and very short period in which to adapt. So it's been a highly problematic, difficult policy to implement for a number of reasons. So what the project tries to do is to look at how that transition can be made more or easier, particularly for disadvantaged learners in difficult delivery contexts. Textbooks, we know, play a really important role in terms of education quality. They provide a source access to the curriculum, not only for learners when they're in school, but also, particularly now in the context of COVID, out of school as well. So they're really critical learning resources. But it's not just the learners, it's the teachers as well that benefit from textbooks and the content knowledge in textbooks. As we know, often teachers are not as well prepared in terms of subject content knowledge as they might be. Also, in terms of pedagogical content knowledge, subject-specific pedagogical content knowledge, textbooks can play a role. And I will illustrate that a bit later on. So what we want to argue really is that the textbooks at the moment are really often very inappropriate. And I want to, because the level of English required of learners is too high. And I want to talk a little bit about the last project and how we worked with textbook editors and writers to try and produce more accessible textbooks. Okay, let's see if there's right. So I want to talk a little bit about the textbooks, talk a little bit about the limitations of education through a European language, review that evidence, although I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Talk a little bit about what we know about textbook design and use in Sub-Saharan Africa and the readability of textbooks, and then talk a little bit about what we mean by the concepts of language-supported textbooks and why we think they're important. Okay, so we aimed in the project to work with publishers to develop and trial prototype textbook chapters in science, social studies and mathematics, targeted at primary 4 learners. We worked with teacher trainers to train teachers to use the textbooks in the context of language supportive pedagogies. And I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that too. We also worked with the ministry to try to develop guidelines to ensure that textbooks are language appropriate. And again, our contacts with the inclusion of the British Council in the team was important in that respect. So they have some traction with the Rwandan Education Board. Okay, so what did we do? Well, we started off with a baseline test, language test, which was designed by a language assessment specialist at Bristol, Professor Yu, and it really tested children's vocabulary, but also their comprehension in English at the beginning. We then drafted and piloted new materials in science, social studies and mathematics. We wrote samples of materials, we trialed them in classrooms, and we conducted observations. We looked at how the materials were being used, we interviewed teachers, and we conducted some training with the writers and the ministry textbook evaluators to try to draw attention to the importance, the value of language supportive approaches. Okay, so I want to start off. I think most of us are familiar with these, with this literature, which looks at learner ability in L2 in Sub-Saharan Africa. We know that learner levels of ability in European languages are often too low for them to use the language effectively for learning. We know that at the switch of medium and later, L2 medium curricular language demands far exceed language ability. That learners find it hard to understand teachers and don't talk much in classrooms in L2. And of course, this has implications for pedagogy. It has implications for the use of more learner-centered approaches, but it also impacts on inequality in the classroom. For children who are less able, have less exposure to English at home, you know, it's particularly hard for them. It has an impact on gender because, you know, when children, that often boys benefit in those kinds of classrooms where there's limited opportunities for teachers to ask, learners to ask questions. It's very low, learners find it hard to write about difficult, complex content and to read about them in the textbooks. We know that. We know that there are very low levels of reading ability in English. We know from Uwezo that this is the case across East Africa. And we know from previous research led out of Bristol, the SPINE project in Zanzibar, that, you know, the L2, having to conduct examinations in L2 seriously disadvantages non-native speakers. And that, you know, the premise, no doubt, for your own project, that of course ability in the medium of instruction is linked with low school achievement. We know that from our own multi-level modelling of the SUCMET data that we did as part of the EdQual project, which looks at education quality. And of course there are interactions there, that it's not just children who have English as a second or third language, but, you know, if you put that together with poverty, with rurality, with gender, you see intersecting inequalities, and that language tends to multiply and exacerbate, and that's significant. So I think most of us are familiar with this research. I should say though that as with that actually, you know, I'm very pleased to hear that you are doing this research looking at the relationship between language and achievement in Africa, because the evidence base is actually quite thin. Some of the evidence we have to draw on is quite patchy and uneven across the continent. But we do know as well that teachers teaching in a European language are often not fluent enough to use acceptable levels of learner subject knowledge. That, you know, we know that this often leads to code switching, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but of course is very uneven in its implications. We don't know the effects of code switching. There isn't enough research about that, but we do know that, you know, that actually where language is used more systematically, where two languages, bilingual approach is used more systematically, as for example in translanguaging kinds of approaches, that this can be effective. But in the context of African classrooms, code switching is often used unsystematically. And that teacher education doesn't really deal with bilingual approaches. It doesn't teach teachers, it doesn't educate teachers in the use in how to cope specifically with multilingual classrooms. So we know that you know, from the literature, that extended L1 medium education with a focus on academic language proficiency to at least the first 6 years is really important. That children need to master at least basic concepts in the mother tongue before they have the proficiency, the language proficiency in the second language to be able to develop their cognitively. We know that bilingual education, which is of course common in other parts of the world, can play an important role in thereafter in supporting the transition, and in its own right is valuable in its own right, a bilingual approach. And we know that language supportive approaches elsewhere, including, for example, CLIL in Europe, are important because they can assist teachers in helping children make the transition from L1 to L2. But again, you know, it is important to point out that some of this language, for example, you know, this idea that about the first 6 years, whilst it receives a support, you know, in the literature on education in Sub-Saharan Africa, much of the empirical evidence actually comes from North America and from Jim Cummings' original research. So we, again, you know, it's an under-researched area. So again, you know, I'm delighted to hear that, that you're doing work in this area. Okay, so we know that learner L2 medium reading ability is often low. In Rwanda in 2004, for example, 0.77% of Rwandan primary 6 learners could read adequately for learning in English at primary level, so a very small percentage. And in Tanzania, there's also only 49% of Tanzanian Year 7 learners could read a Year 2 story. That's data from Uwezo. You've probably got more up-to-date data in your project. I doubt things have improved though. We know that textbooks are mainly designed for native speakers, readers, and have high readability. We know that textbooks may often not be used, partly for that reason. We did a sister study in Rwanda. We looked at the textbook use, and it was very, very limited. The place where you find textbooks is often in the cupboard, locked up to the head teacher's office. And partly that's to do with the fact that they don't trust parents or learners with textbooks often, but also because they're often considered to be not that helpful. And the dominant approach is to, of course, chalk and talk with the use of the blackboard. Where textbooks are used often is to support, by teachers to help them write notes on the blackboard. So an initial teacher education doesn't prepare teachers to teach reading in L2 subjects. So, you know, this is an example of a science textbook in primary 4 in Rwanda. And I think, you know, when I was 8 years old or 9 or 10 years old, I'd find this very, very difficult. I'd find this language very, very difficult to take on board. And you know, I'm a native English speaker. Can you imagine if you're, you know, a non-native English speaker? So you can see here some of the demands, you know, the linguistic demands. You can see the long sentences, the big words, the difficulty in being able to interpret these words. But we also know that actually, you know, conventional readability measures have limited use. So the Fleisch-Kincaid test, for example, which we used to analyze the textbook readability, is actually designed for native English speakers. I know that the British Council have been interested in developing tests that apply to non-native speakers of English, to contexts where there are non-native speakers of English, to evaluate the readability of textbooks. But I'm not sure how far those initiatives have got, and I suspect that there still aren't sufficient initiatives out there, technologies that can help us to assess the readability of books, and that is a finding in its own right, really. But we need those readability measures. We need to be able to, but we need measures that can also not just assess the vocabulary and the length of sentences, but can also do things like look at the skill demands that are required of textbooks, the extent to which textbooks contain activities that enable, facilitate talking, reading and writing. Textbooks that make good use of visuals to help children interpret the text and that encourage bilingualism. So we argue there's an urgent need for these kinds of measures in Sub-Saharan Africa as elsewhere that can really help us understand the readability of textbooks. So what are the key messages? We know that language abilities for L2 levels are often too low for learning in subjects effectively, that teacher language levels are too low for teaching effectively. We know that initial and continuing teacher education is inadequate in terms of teaching native speakers or multilingual contexts. We know that textbooks are too hard and difficult, and the overall effect is to depress academic success. Okay, so what are features then of language supportive textbooks? Well, they are firstly that bilingualism is promoted, that the books encourage learner talk in L1 as a basis for them talking or writing in L2. So exercises encourage learners first to discuss complex ideas, concepts in the mother tongue, to clarify those concepts through group work, group discussion, and then to reinterpret those concepts in English. That texts are readable. In other words, unlike the example that I showed you, sentences are short. There is a clear structure to the discourse. That the vocabulary is limited to what's essential, the technical vocabulary to what is actually essential. That there are glossaries in the first language that children can refer to, often at the back of the book, or in accompanying dictionaries, or in a margin at the side of the page, and that the text is supported by visuals. And so there's a few points to be made here. That, because this is where we started running into difficulties with the Rwandan Education Board, with the Rwandan government. And it's instructive to report these. It's important to report these, that, there's a pushback. There's a pushback against having any talk in the mother tongue and in having things like glossaries, because this is what we were told, it makes the children lazy. That's what they say, and it makes the teachers lazy. And of course, we know that's not the case, that it can, what we found is that having that support actually supported learning in the classroom. The teachers welcomed it. They welcomed the books, as did the learners. But I think here as well, there's perhaps different things going on. So I think, sometimes we know that, there are views of bilingualism, old views of bilingualism as being a bad thing, that the brain only has capacity for one language. There's those kinds of assumptions going on. There are assumptions about as I say, that it might make people, discourage people from actually learning a second language. But I think there's also assumptions based on the experiences of policymakers themselves, which in very class divided societies may be very different. And I think this is a really important point, actually. It's not central necessarily to this particular research, but I think it's germane to the whole issue, because if you are lucky enough to be brought up in an urban environment with access to English books, films, TV programs, where it's more likely that your parents speak in English, that your friends speak in English, you're at a huge advantage compared to if you grow up in a rural area with limited access to these materials in English and to other speakers of English. So it is essentially a class issue, I think, in important respects. But anyway, visuals are used to support learning, a varied range of visuals. And this is significant too, I think, in the context of ESD, of a concern with sustainable development. Because of course, once you start bringing in locally relevant visuals, these can help to reinforce indigenous ideas, ways of knowing, ways of doing things. So for example, in Kinyarwanda, there are, I think, 16 words that describe grass, and from a sustainable development perspective, that's important, because that encapsulates through language indigenous knowledge, understanding of the natural world. And there's a full repertoire of language supportive tasks that can help learners learn. So this is what we mean. So, this is an example from one of the textbooks that we produce. So you can see that, we've tried to highlight, use local examples, use indigenous crafts and understandings of soil, which of course in agrarian societies is so important for sustainable development. But you can see that strong use of visuals, a clear presentation, a simple presentation, short sentences, but also you can see the activities encourage children to speak, to read, to write, first in the mother tongue and in English. Okay. Okay, I think we've so, and then, you know, linked to the language supportive text, this idea of language supported pedagogy, that, you know, it specifically encourages more learner-centered approaches. And, you know, we know, for example, from Joe Westbrook et al.'s, you know, review, systematic review, that in general, you know, more learner-centered kinds of approaches have a positive impact on attainment of learners. It's a complex picture, of course, and there's a danger, of course, in assuming that Western learner-centered approaches necessarily apply, but to the extent that they are taken up and used and adapted and appropriated by African teachers, they tend to have a positive impact on learning outcomes. So, you know, language supportive pedagogy is about teachers using accessible talking style, using clear instructions and signals of lesson discourse, to encourage questioning, prompting, checking comprehension. So lots of backwards and forwards, talking in class. They support learner understandings with visuals. They make explicit use of 2 languages. So in a sense, you can see here how, you know, those of you who are familiar with translanguaging kinds of ideas, you know, there is some synergy here, because translanguaging is about understanding the value of different languages and actually, you know, systematically making use of multilingualism, not as a problem, but as a resource in classrooms. So it also encourages group and pair work, that learners talk in L1 about difficult ideas, that they talk in L2 only with strong support once they've clarified ideas, that learners talk in L1 about comprising in L2. They first, and you know, it's interesting because, you know, similar initiatives with disadvantaged learners or non-native and working class learners in English schools, you know, this talking for writing work that's done in many classes in England. You know, it's a similar kind of idea. If you get children first to talk about ideas before they write, and reading, learners talk in L1 before and after reading in L2. So they're constantly checking with themselves and with each other their understanding through this process and of course, you know, this has the added benefit of developing metacognitive skills, because in the process, children are thinking about their thinking. They're thinking about their use of language, which has its own benefits, as we know. Okay, so the last project advocates the specialist pedagogy appropriate to learners with low ability in L2. We sought to train publishers, and I have to say, you know, the publishers and textbook writers were very responsive. They were very responsive to all of this. Many of them are teachers themselves. They come from an education, from a classroom background, so they know the value of what this kind of approach can bring. And it's also liberating for them, because I think, you know, there's a view of education quality that pervades in Africa as elsewhere, that, you know, something is only of a good quality if it's really, really difficult. If it looks difficult, if the words are really difficult. And of course, we know the opposite, that, you know, things are of a good quality, materials are of a good quality when learners can actually understand and learn from them, which sometimes has the opposite implication for the complexity of the language used. So, you know, looking to the future, you know, it advocates, it's consistent with bilingualism, and as I've already suggested, perhaps with a translanguaging kind of framework as well. Okay, I'll leave it there because I'm sure there are lots of questions, and I'm sure I've gone a bit too long, for which I apologise. So back to you, Colin.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. I think it's now actually over to me. So yeah, thanks very much for that. Yeah, really interesting and thorough presentation. So we're encouraging people to pose questions in the chat box if you can. So if you can type questions and then I will say them out loud for everyone's benefit. So yeah, any questions that kind of came up during the course of the presentation? I know some people have already said, will the presentation be made available afterwards? Because there's obviously a lot of material covered there. So maybe while we just wait for people to type and wait for the questions to come in, I would just like to sort of, yeah, maybe I can make the most of the opportunity to ask a question myself. So I was wondering to what extent you think that this is, so obviously you've talked about the links between, for example, Rwanda and the UK, how much it might apply to other contexts. So obviously the larger project looks at other countries as well. So bilingualism is one thing, and I guess multilingualism is the sort of next question. So what would you do in a context that's perhaps different from Rwanda, where you have one language but then other community languages? So our project draws on Tanzania, where you have Swahili at primary school, at least, as the medium of education, but learners coming to school might speak multiple other languages. So I don't know if you sort of got thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and of course, English in Tanzania is the third or sometimes fourth language for many learners. So yes, we do have there is a sister project in Tanzania that's run by my colleague Angeline Barrett and colleagues at the University of Dar es Salaam and Dodoma, and they are working with these textbooks, and they find that even if it's Swahili that's used as the that's assumed as the L1 in implementing this approach, it has a beneficial effect even for learners for whom Swahili is a second language.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks very much. So we've got quite a few questions coming in. So one question here from Florence. So sort of thinking with policy and sort of government at the back of your mind, do you have comparative evidence that supports this? So I suppose outcomes, sort of evidence of more effective, more efficient learning. So you talked a little bit about sort of pre and post tests, perhaps showing that this works. We probably all believe that it works, but yeah, in terms of convincing policymakers.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question, and I think that is the next step. We need to scale it up. We have evidence, we have quantitative and qualitative evidence from Rwanda, but I think it probably does need to be scaled up. It would certainly help as a next step to get that kind of comparative evidence. It would be interesting to know from other participants in the session whether others are aware of similar research or projects or findings elsewhere.
Yeah, maybe other people, if they know of examples or things, you can also write that in the chat. So we've got another question coming in. So the textbook that you showed, so it says the English textbook, but I think the one with the images, I'm assuming, what grade was that? And are there similar books for early grades, I suppose? So if you have textbooks which would be in Kinyarwanda entirely, and then the one that we saw which was in English, and then with discussion in Kinyarwanda, or perhaps you can just explain how that sort of follows on. Yeah,
so that's this example is from a P4, primary 4, which is the children are, we know that it doesn't necessarily correspond to an age, but on average about 8 years old. But in the Tanzanian research, they're looking at S2, secondary 2, which is where they make the transition there, I believe. So we've looked at transition points. We've particularly targeted points at which learners are expected to transit.
Yeah. So some other questions we've got. Again, this makes absolute sense and all sounds, you know, it's all very convincing, but what are the implications that we know of in these kind of contexts? So particularly in the context of low resource countries or classrooms. So this is obviously still with the textbook, but also just the production of these types of things. If you can kind of comment on that, teacher training, all of those.
Yeah. I mean, what we found is the, you know, how important the textbook selection panel in the Ministry of Education is in all of this, in playing a kind of gatekeeper role, and the importance of the guidelines for evaluating textbooks. So there's a need also to raise awareness amongst textbook evaluators, not just textbook writers and publishers. And we found that you know, we managed to get some traction with the textbook guidelines, which was a kind of small victory, really, if you like, in Rwanda, in the sense that they did start to include clauses about, you know, keeping sentences simple, using relevant illustrations, and so on, which was a kind of at least a partial achievement. But it's very difficult. It's very and you know, it was interesting because when the project was originally commissioned, it was under the auspices. It was given the green light by the Rwandan Education Board. They accepted this project along with several others at the time being proposed by DFID. And one of the kind of background factors we found out later was that the DG at that time had actually, you know, been exposed to workshops where bilingualism, the importance of bilingual approaches, had been discussed. So, you know, he was very progressive, that particular DG. He understood what we were trying to do. So he gave it the green light, but then he was replaced. And so the situation, suddenly we found a lot more resistance. But of course, you know, the issue of English is not just governed at the Ministry of Education. It's not just decided there. In the Rwandan case, as elsewhere, it takes on a deeply political hue. And there you're up against, you know, interests, ideas, decisions made by people who have very limited understanding of the educational implications of what's being decided. So it really needs to be, you know, a multifaceted approach that also takes account of the political dynamics involved.
Yeah, absolutely. You can sort of see all those different pieces of the puzzle coming together, and then yes, also how much that depends on an individual. So if someone's very receptive to that kind of thing and then moves on. That question actually leads quite nicely into the next question, which is sort of talking a little bit, so you mentioned a bit about teacher training as well. And so what might be the role of teacher training colleges and teacher training programs in changing practice in classroom? And to what extent can they take new initiatives and adopt things like this, or are they sort of restricted and constrained by government? What do you sort of see the role of teaching the teachers essentially in that context?
Yeah, no, that's a $1 million question. And of course, you know, we're seeing changes in the way that teacher education takes place in Africa, which is very welcome and long overdue in many contexts, where teacher education is increasingly coming under the spotlight, because of course it's so important in all of this. In the sister project in Tanzania, they're working with and out of teacher education colleges, because they realize the importance, the fundamental importance of this. If we can get teacher educators on board. And of course, they also have a really important role in not only in disseminating, but actually in supporting research and communities of practice in schools that can amongst teachers, amongst educators that they work with in these kinds of areas. So they are a very important resource, and I think you know, very important constituency to try and influence in this. We did manage in Rwanda to, well, we did work with the Rwandan College of Education, and you know, some of the colleagues, for example, Dr. Aurora Boweo, who was our partner at is now heading up the primary division there, and I know he's been quite instrumental in trying to introduce these kinds of approaches. But again, you're up against, you know, very really entrenched interests and ways of doing things, some of which go back to the colonial period. You know, we're in a situation where many teacher training institutions are still quite divorced from classroom realities, and where the approach remains didactic.
Absolutely, and I think, yeah, drawing on my experiences from Tanzania, when they've decided to prioritize teacher training programs and then have developed sort of, you know, the fastest one possible, you know, to kind of, yeah, quick stream, fast stream people into those teacher roles. There's not much time to discuss these kind of ideas in those kind of schemes as well.
Yes.
So sort of moving now perhaps from the teaching and from the classroom, we have another question, which is, I suppose, sort of about how things might have changed from some of the earlier times. And you did touch on this a little bit, so kind of more informal learning. So perhaps, again, in the case of English, more engagement with English outside of the classroom, social media, how you think that then plays out inside the classroom. I suppose that's really, even, you know, in the last few years or sort of last 5 years compared to 10 years ago, whether that's, yeah, I suppose increasing people's exposure to some of these other languages, or if you have evidence of that at all.
Sorry, I'm not sure I completely understand the question.
So I think you touched a little bit on this, perhaps in relation to the class divide. So what informal channels of education, so if it's about English, exposure perhaps to TV programs, to social media, means that people now are exposed more to English outside of formal education than they were, let's say, 10 years ago, for example.
Oh, I see. Well, I mean, I don't have evidence really around that. You know, I think that would be an important study. I suspect anecdotally from, you know, that that's the case. But what's very clear is that this divide between, from our analysis of, you know, of the data, you know, shows that this divide, particularly between rural and urban, still exists, you know, very much so. So, you know, people may have more exposure to English, but then, you know, even if people are exposed to English in social media, that's, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that their proficiency in academic English is enhanced. There's a difference, we know from Cummins' work, for example, between, you know, everyday English and proficiency in academic English.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, in different contexts, the same things are kind of coming up, aren't they? We've got some questions about the language background of the teachers you're working with. I suppose here, particularly just, for example, in Rwanda, yeah, sort of what kind of, you did mention a little bit about teacher levels in English and things like that, but just what kind of backgrounds in terms of language are the teachers coming from?
Yeah, well, again, you know, this was part of the issue, because when they made the transition, many teachers, and again, you know, there was a division here, or there were differences, for example, between urban and rural teachers. but many of them, were used to, were brought up in French. We're talking about a country that was francophone, and it was really those who went into exile under, before the genocide, after the 1959 pogrom, that went to places like Uganda and Tanzania, that developed English really as a global language. So there are those kinds of divides. So many of the teachers, particularly in the rural areas, didn't have proficiency in English, and really varied even amongst the teaching force.
Yeah, that's really interesting in terms of sort of time span and presume age as well. So of the teachers and what language they would have been exposed to in that context as well.
Yes, particularly the older teachers. That's a very good point.
Absolutely, yeah. So older teachers would have had more French input. I think probably just one more question. There's some very interesting discussion going on in the chat, but I think one more sort of question about the textbooks again. So obviously you presented this, well, the one that we see at the moment. And I suppose the question there is, are you assuming that in other contexts where the textbook is in English, what is actually happening in the classroom? So do you still think that, and this links to our project, I suppose, so even if the textbook is completely in English, like the one you showed with the long paragraphs and difficult vocabulary, do you have an idea of what's happening in practice in those contexts? So are teachers still using Kinyarwanda, perhaps, or a combination of Kinyarwanda and English to explain those things, or are they relying on the textbook and sort of reading sections out and things?
Yeah, no, I mean, so we know that teachers use the textbooks. They copy them sometimes verbatim into their notes, which then go onto the board. That they then try and explain. They use code switching. They code switch to try and explain this difficult content. But as we know with code switching, at the risk of repeating myself, it's really it's not a systematic way of trying to interpret difficult concepts with learners. So yes, it's highly problematic. So I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's again that sort of it's what's happening in practice when you're provided with these materials, what teachers are actually doing to navigate those contexts. I think those are most of the questions. There's quite a lot of sort of discussion going on in the chat, so I'm going to leave that for the time being, although I do see so yeah, maybe we can all just join me in thanking Leon again for the really fantastic presentation, and obviously colleagues that you've worked with on this as well. We will do a short write-up of the presentation afterwards, and assuming that Leon's happy for that to be shared, we'll put that up on our website. And so this is the last in our sort of presentation, so the last in our series of 5 in this series, but we will be having one more session in a fortnight's time, which will be a panel discussion. So the idea there is to draw on the themes that have come out through the previous sessions. So I know there was a question about whether that is going ahead. That is going ahead, but it's just in a slightly different format. So thank you, Leon, and thanks all for joining us today.
Thank you all very much. I should say that this has been written up. There's a special issue of Comparative Education, so I'll send the link to you for that, and as well as the slides. But thank you all again, and it's been a great pleasure to be.
That would be fantastic. I think you also mentioned at the beginning a website or a web link. I don't know if you wanted to put that in the chat, or you can send that through to us and we can put that up on the website afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Will do. I think that might be easier.
Okay, great. We can do. We'll do that. We'll make sure that goes up on the website afterwards. Okay. Thanks very much, and nice to see everyone.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.